Nobody expected fireworks at the World Future Forum that afternoon. It was supposed to be a thoughtful, maybe even a little dry, panel discussion on artificial intelligence and ethics. A bunch of experts sitting on stage in San Francisco talking about algorithms, regulation, and transparency. You know, standard tech conference stuff. But when Representative Jasmine Crockett started speaking, things took a sharp turn. And when Elon Musk, who wasn't even on the panel, suddenly stood up in the front row and interrupted her mid-sentence, the entire room froze. This wasn't part of the program. Nobody invited Musk to speak during that session. But there he was, calling out from the audience, his voice cutting through the air. "That's just fear-mongering," he said. "You don't understand AI. You're afraid of something you can't control." The moderator looked stunned. The other panelists didn't say a word, and the crowd, made up of policy people, AI researchers, startup founders, and a lot of tech media, sat completely silent. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She looked at him, calm as ever, and said, "Mr. Musk, I was just about to bring up some of your company's AI work. Since you're here, maybe we can talk about it directly." At that point, phones came out. Cameras were already rolling. What happened next would ripple across social media, corporate boardrooms, and even Capitol Hill. This wasn't just a clash between a billionaire and a congresswoman. It became something bigger, a moment of reckoning about power, ethics, and truth in the age of AI. Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive at that panel unprepared, far from it. What most people didn't know was that her team had been quietly digging into AI government contracts for the past 6 months. It started with a simple question. How much federal money is actually going into artificial intelligence, and who's getting it? The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. Big tech companies, the same ones criticizing government bureaucracy and calling for freedom to innovate, were also quietly accepting billions in government contracts. Some of those deals were public, most weren't, and right in the middle of it all was Elon Musk. His company, XAI, had been awarded a classified Department of Defense contract worth nearly $2 billion. That deal never made headlines. It wasn't announced with a press release, but it was there, buried deep in financial filings and procurement reports. So when Crockett stood on that stage and started talking about transparency in AI, she already knew what might happen. She knew Musk was in the building. She knew he had a history of challenging politicians in public, and she came ready. When Musk called her out, Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't get defensive. Instead, she reached into her folder and pulled out a printed document. "This is from your company's SEC filing last quarter," she said. "It shows your growth projections are based in large part on a federal AI contract, the same one that's listed as classified in public budget records." Musk responded quickly. "That's national security," he said. "You don't know the context." Crockett stayed steady. "I know that while you were tweeting about the dangers of AI surveillance, your company was building autonomous surveillance platforms with taxpayer money." You could hear people shifting in their seats. The room had gone from awkward silence to total focus. Musk tried to pivot. He said, "That's not the same thing. We're building safety mechanisms. We're doing what OpenAI and Google won't." Crockett didn't let up. "Then why does your contract use the same foundational model architecture as the systems you've called dangerous? Why lobby against oversight for projects you're profiting from?" Musk was visibly frustrated now. He stood up, looked toward the moderator, and said, "I don't need to stand here and explain defense projects to people who've never written a line of code." And just like that, he turned and walked out. Crockett watched him leave. Then she looked back at the audience and said, "He said I don't understand AI, but I walked in here with his contracts, his public statements, and his financial disclosures. That's not fear, that's oversight." The audience didn't cheer, not right away. It was one of those moments where people didn't quite know what to do. Then the applause started, slow at first, then louder. Even some of Musk's supporters clapped. The moment had shifted, and everyone in that room felt it. It didn't start as an investigation. At first, it was just a couple of staffers in Jasmine Crockett's office asking questions. They'd been noticing something odd. More and more AI companies were showing up in congressional briefings, asking for funding, talking about partnerships with the military, with Homeland Security, with the Department of Energy. These weren't the flashy Silicon Valley startups you see on stage at TED Talks. These were quiet, highly technical, and deeply embedded in government infrastructure. And then there was Elon Musk. Publicly, he was talking about AI as a threat. It could destroy humanity, he tweeted. Unchecked AI is one of the biggest dangers we face. He was warning about surveillance states, calling out OpenAI, saying governments shouldn't be involved in model training. But behind closed doors, his companies were doing something very different. Crockett's team started connecting the dots. A new company called xAI, Musk's latest venture, had been quietly awarded at least 3 major federal contracts. One was from the Pentagon, one from NASA, another through DARPA. None of them were announced publicly. The team started digging. They pulled procurement records, searched SEC filings, analyzed lobbying disclosures. They looked at every tweet Musk had posted about AI for the last 2 years and compared them to what his companies were bidding on. The contradictions were everywhere. The day he tweeted, "The government shouldn't be training AIs," xAI had submitted a bid to the Department of Defense to provide foundational model training for battlefield robotics. The same week, he warned that centralized AI control is authoritarian. His company signed an exclusive partnership with a major federal agency to build data integration tools for surveillance. That's when Crockett got personally involved. She wasn't just a congresswoman. Before coming to Washington, Jasmine Crockett was a civil rights attorney. She knew how to build a case, how to stick to facts, how to cross-examine someone without raising her voice. It's what she was known for: clarity, precision, and calm under pressure. When she saw what Musk's companies were doing and how different it was from what he was saying, she made a decision. If the opportunity came, she was going to confront him publicly, not to start a fight, not to get headlines, but to make a point. She knew it had to be airtight. No vague accusations, no political talking points, just facts. Verified, documented, and defensible. So for weeks, she and her team built what they jokingly called the AI receipt folder. It was over 200 pages long. Contracts, bids, government performance reports, internal memos obtained through FOIA requests, even screenshots of Musk's tweets side by side with evidence from his own company's financial disclosures. And they waited. The World Future Forum seemed like the right time. The panel wasn't supposed to be controversial. It was about ethics in AI, a chance for policymakers and scientists to talk about principles. Crockett was invited because she'd been one of the few members of Congress pushing for transparency in AI funding. Nothing dramatic was planned. But Crockett's team saw that Musk was also registered for the event. He was scheduled to give a keynote the following day. They knew his reputation. They knew he might try to hijack a conversation, especially one that questioned how AI power was being concentrated in private hands. So they made a new plan. If Musk interrupted, Crockett would be ready. And as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. It's easy to forget now, but in the moment, nobody thought Musk's interruption would backfire. The first reaction from the crowd was curiosity, excitement even. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, was jumping into a live debate. He'd done this kind of thing before, popped into discussions, challenged panelists, made headlines. Usually, it worked. He'd make a few sharp comments, dominate the room, maybe tweet a joke later and walk away looking confident. That's what people expected. What they didn't expect was that Jasmine Crockett had come with his entire record, printed, indexed, and cross-referenced, sitting in a folder on her lap, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Let's take a quick look at what was inside. One document was a funding timeline from the Department of Defense. It showed that xAI had received over $1.8 billion in classified contracts in less than 18 months. Another showed that Tesla's AI division had applied for federal credits, while Musk was publicly criticizing government support for AI R&D. They had proof that xAI was building autonomous surveillance platforms, the exact kind Musk claimed he was trying to stop. They had internal reports showing that xAI had lobbied against transparency rules that would have required them to disclose the details of those systems. And they had Musk's own words, dozens of tweets calling for decentralized AI, free markets, and non-government interference, posted on the same days his companies were signing exclusive contracts with federal agencies. It wasn't illegal, but it was clear. The public image Musk had built as an independent anti-government innovator didn't line up with what his businesses were actually doing, and Jasmine Crockett was about to show the world. Back on stage, the tension was rising. Elon Musk had just challenged Jasmine Crockett in front of a room full of tech leaders, investors, and journalists. He thought he was calling out a politician for misunderstanding innovation. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that he'd walked right into the center of her investigation. Crockett held up a printed page. "This is a Department of Defense expenditure report," she said, her voice even and steady. "It lists your company, xAI, as the recipient of $142 million last quarter alone for a project labeled Autonomous Surveillance Coordination." She paused. "That's the kind of project you've warned the public about. You've tweeted that AI surveillance is dangerous, even authoritarian. And yet, your company is building the very thing you claim to oppose, with taxpayer money." Musk tried to wave it off. "You're taking that out of context," he said. "That contract is about safety. It's defensive AI. It's not surveillance in the way you're implying." But Crockett didn't back down. "If it's defensive," she said, "why is the project classified? Why is it exempt from congressional review? Why is it being developed without third-party ethical testing?" Silence. Nobody said a word. No coughing, no murmuring, no shuffling of papers, just stillness. Because the audience, many of whom came in siding with Musk, were now leaning forward in their seats, listening closely. And Crockett was just getting started. She pulled out another sheet. "This is a lobbying disclosure from your government relations team. It shows that xAI spent over $2 million last year trying to block legislation that would have required public reporting on all AI systems used in law enforcement or military operations." She glanced back at Musk. "That same week, you tweeted that AI regulation was necessary and that transparency should be a priority." Then she said it clearly. "Mr. Musk, what you say in public doesn't match what your companies are doing behind closed doors." For a moment, Musk didn't respond, and that by itself was unusual. He's known for comebacks, one-liners, deflections, something. But in that moment, he just stood there, eyes locked on the pages in Crockett's hand. The moderator, clearly nervous, tried to cut in. "We should probably..." But Musk raised his hand, interrupting. "No, let's talk about it," he said, his tone sharper now. "Let's talk about Congress. You people waste more money in a week than I've ever received in contracts. Maybe look in the mirror before pointing fingers." A few people in the crowd nodded. A couple even clapped. But Crockett didn't take the bait. "I'm not defending waste," she said. "I'm calling out hypocrisy." Then she brought out the last document, the one she'd saved for this exact moment. "This is a combined financial summary prepared by the Congressional Budget Office and the Government Accountability Office. It shows that over the past 20 months, your companies, not just xAI, but Tesla, SpaceX, and Neuralink, have received a total of $4.7 billion in federal grants, tax credits, and contract awards." She held the page up for everyone to see. And yet, in that same time frame, you've publicly criticized almost every major government program that supported those payments. You called subsidies welfare for billionaires. You said government funding distorts the market. And you claimed your companies succeed on their own. Then she looked right at him. "So tell me, Mr. Musk, if you don't believe in government support, why take it? Why lobby for it behind the scenes while attacking it in public? That was it, the moment. The audience, including journalists who had covered Musk for over a decade, began to realize they weren't watching a debate. They were watching something else, a reckoning, a public accountability moment that felt too real, too specific, too undeniable to ignore. Musk opened his mouth, then closed it, then looked down at the floor. He didn't have a ready answer, and for the first time in a very long time, Elon Musk looked stuck. He took a step back, then another, and then, without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the room. Nobody clapped right away. People were too stunned. But once it sank in that Elon Musk had walked out of his own confrontation live and on camera, the mood shifted, and the story was already spreading online. Within minutes, clips of the exchange hit social media. The hashtags #CrockettReceipts and #Elon Walkout were trending worldwide, and the internet, which usually sides with the biggest voice in the room, started shifting hard in her direction. Because Crockett hadn't just held her ground. She'd brought the facts, and she delivered them with clarity, calm, and total control. The footage was everywhere within an hour. Clips of the exchange, usually less than 2 minutes long, were spreading like wildfire across X, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. But they weren't edited for drama. They didn't need to be. The raw footage was enough. One of the most powerful men in the world had walked into a live discussion thinking he'd teach a lesson, and walked out completely unprepared for what he faced. The internet noticed. Some headlines called it a rare moment of real accountability. Others described it as a masterclass in political preparation. But most just went with the obvious. Elon Musk storms out of ethics panel after Congresswoman confronts him with receipts. It didn't matter what side of the political spectrum you were on. The facts were laid out clearly. And for once, the person in power didn't have a spin-ready answer. Inside Musk's companies, the mood shifted fast. At XAI, executives began reviewing contracts to prepare for media fallout. Some engineers were told to pause work on certain projects, at least temporarily, until the PR team could sort out the messaging. At Tesla, investors wanted clarity. Questions started popping up about Musk's comments regarding government support. Shareholders were asking whether his public statements posed risks to the company. Legal risks, reputational risks, even regulatory risks. And at SpaceX, things got quiet, which was unusual. Normally, Musk would have tweeted something sarcastic or combative by now, but this time he didn't. His account went silent for more than 48 hours, an eternity in Musk time. The silence wasn't just strategic. According to reports from insiders, there was genuine confusion. Nobody had expected that level of research. Nobody thought Crockett would have all the contracts, filings, and lobbying records lined up and ready. Nobody imagined she'd stay so calm when challenged, or that she'd flip the script without ever raising her voice. She wasn't just ready. She was 10 steps ahead. Meanwhile, Crockett was back in Washington, and suddenly, in demand. Her office phone rang nonstop. Media requests flooded in. She was invited on every major news show, CNN, MSNBC, even a rare appearance on a late-night talk show. But she turned most of them down. When asked why, her staff gave a simple answer: the work speaks for itself. And it did. The folder she'd referenced during the panel, the one with all the documentation, was turned into a formal report. Her team worked with the Government Accountability Office to finalize it, and within days, it was released publicly under the title, Public Funds, Private Profits, a Preliminary Review of AI Contract Transparency. It became the most downloaded congressional report of the year. The report didn't just focus on Musk. It highlighted a trend. Over $19 billion in government contracts had been awarded to private AI firms in the past 2 years. Most of those deals lacked public oversight. Many were granted without competitive bidding. and nearly all of them came with little to no ethical review. Crockett didn't call for a ban on these contracts. She wasn't anti-innovation. In fact, the report opened with a statement she'd written herself. AI is changing the world. But if the public is funding its development, then the public has the right to know how that money is used and what is being built with it. The response was immediate. Members of Congress, including some who rarely agreed with her on anything, started referencing the report in committee meetings. A bipartisan working group on AI oversight was formed, and new legislation began circulating to require full disclosure of all AI-related contracts over $100 million. Crockett had gone from underdog to architect of a transparency movement, all in the span of a week. Musk finally broke his silence with a single tweet. It was short, but surprisingly measured. Had a good discussion with @Jasmine Crockett today. Agree that transparency and accountability matter, especially in AI. Some saw it as a concession. Others saw it as damage control. But either way, it was a sign that Musk, who rarely backs down, had felt the impact, and so had his peers. Across Silicon Valley, CEOs started asking their comms teams to run Crockett audits. They wanted to know if any of their public statements could be used against them, if they'd said something about regulation or ethics that didn't match their business practices, if there were inconsistencies between what they tweeted and what they signed. Suddenly, people realized something. Someone out there was keeping receipts, and that changed everything. They called it the Crockett effect. At first, it was just a joke floating around DC, something reporters and staffers said when another CEO suddenly canceled a public appearance or rewrote their speech overnight. But the phrase stuck, because the truth behind it kept showing up over and over again. One confrontation on a stage in San Francisco had sent a message to people who weren't used to being questioned. Somebody is paying attention now. And not just anyone. Someone with a law degree, a public platform, and a team of researchers who knew exactly where to look. The ripple started in politics. Congressional offices across the aisle quietly began running their own reviews of federal AI contracts. Members who had never thought much about procurement oversight were suddenly asking for breakdowns of which companies were receiving money, and for what. Senator Chuck Grassley, no stranger to oversight, issued a statement saying, "If even half of what's in this report is accurate, we've got a problem. The public deserves to know how its money is being spent." A House subcommittee scheduled a series of hearings. One of them would later be titled, AI and Accountability, Public Funding, Private Power. Jasmine Crockett was invited to testify, not just as a witness, but as the lead author of the report that sparked it all. She opened her testimony the same way she had at the panel, calm, focused, and direct. Transparency isn't about politics, it's about trust. If we're asking the public to support innovation, we owe them an honest explanation of how that innovation is built. The ripple hit the business world next. Tech CEOs, many of whom had cheered Musk's outbursts in the past, were suddenly dialing things back. Some companies pulled down old blog posts that criticized federal regulation. Others added disclaimers to public speeches, noting their government partnerships. At least 3 major firms launched internal reviews of their executives' public statements, cross-referencing them with their contract history. One consulting firm even launched a service called narrative risk audits, where companies paid big money to make sure they wouldn't end up in a situation like Musk had. They weren't worried about lawsuits. They were worried about moments, on camera, in public. When someone, anyone, pulled out the receipts. Reputation had become measurable, and executives who once spoke freely about politics, regulation, and ethics were now being coached. Think before you tweet. became the new unofficial policy at several major firms. Then came journalism. Editors and producers across the media landscape realized something. Crockett had just done better accountability journalism in 20 minutes than many full-time reporters had done in a year. She hadn't just made a good point. She'd done the homework, the kind of deep, cross-disciplinary research that journalism programs use to be built on. Contracts, filings, historical quotes, lobbying disclosures, technical timelines. So they took notes. Several outlets, including ProPublica, Wired, and The Intercept, created special investigative teams focused entirely on government funding of AI and tech companies. One major news site hired a data scientist for the first time, not to build a recommendation engine, but to help reporters cross-reference corporate statements with public records. The Columbia Journalism School introduced a new course, Accountability in the Age of Algorithms. The first lecture, a breakdown of the Crockett-Musk confrontation. The ripple didn't stop there. Law schools took notice, not because of the drama, but because of the discipline. What Crockett had done on stage wasn't just a media moment. It was classic litigation technique, a public version of cross-examination. And she didn't do it with tricks or theatrics. She did it with methodical preparation, clear framing, and controlled pacing. By the fall semester, Yale, Georgetown, and Harvard Law had all included case studies based on the confrontation. Some schools even started offering mock congressional hearings as part of trial advocacy courses. In one program, students were challenged to hold a simulated CEO accountable using only publicly available information. Their assignment: build a case without assumptions, without slogans, and without emotion. Just documents, facts, and the ability to present them under pressure. One professor summed it up best. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She just came prepared. That's the new standard. And maybe the biggest ripple of all? It hit the culture. For years, the image of the tech CEO had been almost untouchable. Visionary, bold, unapologetic. Musk embodied that image more than anyone. He disrupted, he challenged, he bent rules and reshaped narratives, and people admired him for it. But Crockett showed something different. She didn't attack success. She didn't argue against innovation. She simply held it accountable. She didn't ask people to cancel Musk. She asked them to listen carefully. And when they did, many of them realized something. Accountability doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes, the strongest voice in the room is the one that refuses to shout. It didn't take long for the world to notice. Within 24 hours of Elon Musk walking off that stage, the video of the confrontation had been subtitled in over a dozen languages and picked up by newsrooms on 5 continents. German outlets framed it as a battle between unregulated capitalism and democratic ethics. British newspapers described it as a blueprint for the kind of tech accountability sorely lacking in Parliament. In Paris, a front-page editorial in Le Monde posed a question. If one U.S. Congresswoman can challenge the richest man in the world with preparation and facts, why haven't European regulators done the same? That sentiment echoed across the European Union. In Brussels, policymakers at the European Commission began reviewing internal communications about ongoing partnerships with American AI companies, including several in which Musk's firms had pending contracts. Margarita Vestager, the EU's competition chief, praised the confrontation publicly, calling it a refreshing demonstration of how facts can still challenge power in a democratic society. Behind the scenes,
her office began drafting amendments to the EU AI Act that would require foreign contractors to disclose their funding sources and lobbying efforts, a direct nod to Crockett's methods. In Canada, the House of Commons scheduled a special ethics committee session titled Tech Contracts and Government Transparency. Members played clips from the Musk-Crockett exchange in the hearing room. One MP remarked, "We just saw what real-time democratic oversight looks like. The United States doesn't often export models of political accountability, but this time they might have set a global standard." Australia's Department of Industry launched a full-scale review of its AI funding strategy. Their press release included language taken directly from Crockett's testimony, and in New Zealand, officials opened a new subcommittee to explore inconsistencies between tech sector public messaging and private behavior. Across democratic nations, a common thread was forming. If these companies, the ones shaping the future of artificial intelligence, are being publicly funded, then the public deserves to know how that money is being used. Crockett hadn't just sparked a national moment. She'd sparked a global reckoning. Even in countries where democracy looks very different, or where transparency isn't exactly encouraged, the confrontation made waves. In China, state media jumped on the story, spinning it to critique U.S. capitalism. The Global Times published a headline that read, "American billionaires rely on government while mocking it, a broken system exposed." Of course, they didn't mention that such a confrontation would be impossible in Beijing. There are no congressional hearings where CEOs are questioned live, and no elected officials confronting billionaires with public records. Still, they amplified the clip heavily. Not to encourage accountability, but to show the world that even in America, power comes with contradictions. Ironically, they proved Crockett's point better than she ever could have. Meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, something else was happening. For years, many international CEOs had watched Musk with a mix of awe and envy. He could say what he wanted, when he wanted. He could move markets with a single tweet. Governments seemed to step back when he entered the room. But after the Crockett incident, they started to wonder if the Musk model had finally hit its limit. A CEO in Germany quietly told Der Spiegel that he was revising his public speaking strategy. "I don't want a Jasmine Crockett moment," he said. "I want my statements to match my numbers." Executives in South Korea, Japan, and even the Middle East began seeking advice on reputation congruence. In plain English, don't say one thing in public and do the opposite in private. The world is watching now. And it wasn't just about optics. The fear was real. If it could happen to Elon Musk, the man who practically owned the narrative for a decade, it could happen to anyone. In schools across the globe, the clip became required viewing. At business schools in Singapore and London, professors dissected the moment frame by frame, showing students how a calm delivery and airtight preparation could outmaneuver charisma and capital. At law schools in Toronto, students studied Crockett's rhetorical strategy alongside cross-examination techniques. São Paulo to Stockholm, Crockett's Gao-backed report became a core reading on public procurement transparency. And in Nairobi, a civic tech initiative called Facts First launched a new online course titled How to Hold Power Accountable: Lessons from Congresswoman Crockett. In less than 2 weeks, her quiet takedown of Musk had become an international case study in the modern mechanics of power and how to challenge it. But perhaps the most unexpected ripple came from inside Musk's own empire. A former SpaceX engineer speaking anonymously put it like this: "We always assumed Elon would talk his way out of anything. But this time,
The facts boxed him in. You can't innovate your way out of a paper trail. Another insider from XAI described the fallout more bluntly. People aren't scared of competitors anymore. They're scared of congressional folders. In the weeks after the confrontation, something subtle but undeniable started to happen. The standard shifted. It wasn't announced in a press release or written into law. It wasn't a dramatic, sweeping change. But you could feel it in boardrooms, briefing memos, and behind closed doors. The unspoken rules of public power had changed. Before, being loud could carry the day. Charisma often trumped clarity. A billionaire's opinion could shut down a hearing. Facts could be brushed off with a smirk or a meme. But not anymore. Not after Crockett. Because what she'd done wasn't just about Elon Musk. It was about what happens when preparation meets platform. When someone decides that the truth matters more than the room. And now, everyone was preparing for their own version of that moment. In Washington, committee hearings started running a little differently. Witnesses were briefed more carefully. Staffers took a second look at statements CEOs had made online. Members of Congress who used to come in with broad talking points started asking for documentation, contracts, dates, filings. They didn't want to just sound smart. They wanted to be ready. A quiet new protocol spread among congressional staff. Check their tweets, check their contracts. It wasn't formal policy. It was more like a cultural upgrade. If you were going to sit across from someone powerful, a tech mogul, a defense contractor, a pharmaceutical CEO, you'd better know what they said last year and what their balance sheets say now. Crockett had shown what was possible. Now everyone was adjusting to the new baseline. In corporate comms departments, the mood was even more urgent. Senior executives who once used social media as their personal soapbox were being pulled into strategy meetings. "We need to tighten this up," one VP of communications said in a leaked internal memo. "No more shooting from the hip on X." Companies started issuing internal reminders. If you're receiving public funding, in any form, your statements need to reflect that. Public messaging, private numbers, and government partnerships all had to be aligned. Or at least defensible. For many companies, this wasn't just about avoiding embarrassment. It was about risk, reputational risk, political risk, even investor risk. And Crockett had just given the world a live demonstration of what that risk looks like, all within 20 minutes on a stage, with no warning, no special effects, and no need to raise her voice. Universities began folding the Crockett-Musk confrontation into their core ethics curriculum. At Harvard Business School, a new case study appeared in the syllabus titled Preparation, Power, and Public Platforms, the Crockett Confrontation. Students were asked to compare Musk's public statements with his company's funding sources, and to debate whether investors should be informed when executive messaging diverges from operational reality. At Georgetown, a lecture series on public narratives and private realities launched with a full session on Crockett's folder, how it was built, what it revealed, and why it landed so effectively. One professor put it simply, "This is what 21st century accountability looks like. Not protests, not speeches, but documented, sourced, undeniable facts, delivered by someone who refuses to be rattled." Even media outlets began adjusting their approach. Editors started asking different questions. When a CEO made a claim about independence, innovation, or being self-funded, reporters dug deeper. Who paid for the R&D? What subsidies were taken? What back-channel lobbying efforts were running in parallel? Journalism was starting to catch up.
One veteran investigative producer said it like this: "We spent years chasing personalities. Crockett reminded us that sometimes the real story is hiding in the paperwork." And something else changed. Something harder to measure. In the public imagination, the myth of the untouchable CEO started to crack.
For years, tech founders had been cast as a kind of modern royalty. Rebels, geniuses, visionaries who were too busy building the future to answer to anyone. But Jasmine Crockett didn't try to fight that myth with insults or ideology. She did it with evidence. She showed that vision doesn't exempt you from responsibility. That if you're building the future using public money, the public deserves to understand what's being built and why. That message hit differently. It wasn't angry. It wasn't performative. It was solid, grounded, and undeniable. By now, Crockett was being asked to speak everywhere, at tech conferences, law schools, even business retreats, but she turned most of them down. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she didn't want to become a symbol. She wasn't chasing influence. She was chasing clarity. When asked how she stayed so composed during the confrontation, she said, "When you've done the work, you don't have to perform. You just present." Every once in a while, something happens that doesn't just change the news cycle. It changes the blueprint. That's what the Crockett-Musk confrontation became. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It wasn't some manufactured drama for clicks. It was a real-time demonstration of what accountability looks like when someone does the homework and delivers the truth with precision and calm. And now, people were taking notes. Because the old playbook, the one built on spin, bravado, vague promises, and public charm, suddenly looked vulnerable. For the first time in a long time, the person holding the mic wasn't the loudest. She was the most prepared, and that was enough. All across the country, and far beyond it, a new kind of preparation was taking root. Nonprofits started training their staff to research like congressional investigators. Local journalists began asking deeper questions about who benefits from city and state tech contracts. Lawyers started building cases with Crockett-style presentations in mind. Simple, sourced, strategic. Activists, too. Not just protesting injustice, but tracking it. Mapping corporate influence. Documenting every public statement. Connecting it to every grant, credit, subsidy, and behind-the-scenes negotiation. The goal wasn't to cancel anyone. It was to create accountability, with facts, not feelings. And in classrooms, from high school civics to university public policy programs, students were watching the clip not for the drama, but for the method. How Crockett stood her ground. How she used language without aggression. How she framed each point with documented proof, building her case one quiet, confident sentence at a time. She didn't react. She responded. She didn't accuse. She revealed. And she didn't seek applause. She let the facts earn it. The result? A new playbook. One rooted in discipline, not disruption. In preparation, not performance. In showing, not shouting. This wasn't the end of flashy speeches or viral moments, but it was a reminder, a powerful one, that even in the loudest, fastest, noisiest media environment in history, the truth, when presented clearly and calmly, still cuts through. It still matters. And it still moves people. For tech leaders, it meant the age of contradiction was no longer safe.
You couldn't attack government spending while banking government checks. You couldn't promote transparency while hiding behind NDAs. You couldn't build billion-dollar contracts on taxpayer funding while tweeting that you did it alone. Because someone might notice, someone might look, someone might be keeping receipts. For politicians, it meant substance matters again. It wasn't enough to go viral. You had to be right, and you had to show your work. People were watching with sharper eyes now. They weren't just listening to who talks loudest. They were listening to who shows up with evidence, who takes questions seriously, who can stay steady under pressure. The Crockett standard had landed, and it was contagious. And for the public, for voters, students, teachers, employees, taxpayers, it was a reminder that power isn't invincible. That the gap between what people say and what they do can be closed with effort, research, and the willingness to speak up, clearly, respectfully, and with facts in hand. That accountability isn't about anger, it's about clarity. That in a world full of noise, preparation is still powerful. Jasmine Crockett didn't take down Elon Musk. That's not the story here. What she did was something far more important. She reminded the world that facts still matter, that being rich and being right are not the same thing, that public funding comes with public responsibility, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one with the folder.